Greetings and welcome back to another episode of Well, Why Not? I know it has been many months, and I, of course, will dedicate an entire episode to why I felt the need to take a pause and stop posting new episodes. But I felt that my first episode back would be better spent talking about safety abroad. Last month, there was some very alarming news coming out of Ecuador, and had a lot of my friends and family worried about me and my family here. So I started thinking a lot more about how this is often the biggest deterrent for people, aside from expenses, for moving abroad. They worry about their safety. There's this perception that where they currently are or their home country is a lot safer than where they would be moving to. And sometimes it is true, but sometimes it isn't. So let's jump right into this episode. So, for those who are tuning in for the first time, I will give a brief reintroduction of myself. My name is Deborah. I've been living abroad now for 14 consecutive years in Latin America. Before that, I had a couple brief stints in other places, and I decided to start this podcast to talk about my experiences and hopefully encourage others who are fearful or feel they don't have enough information about taking the leap and becoming an expat. So, as I mentioned, early January, I think it was probably the first week or second, we had a pretty hectic day of misinformation, curfews being announced, governmental decrees, etc. Unfortunately, this is not too new for Ecuador. I've been here coming up on 8 years, and this definitely wasn't the first time. I think what was different about this time was the source of the sense of urgency. Before, it was linked to protests and social movements, and this time it was linked to what felt like sporadic violence across the country. So, of course, that day we listened, as we always do, to recommendations to stay home. And I think it was recommended for everyone, where possible, to work from home for the remainder of the week. I think it was a Tuesday that it happened. So as you can imagine, a lot of phone calls, a lot of messages, people wondering if I'm okay, if I'm safe. And luckily, we all were. None of my close family or friends were hurt. And for the most part, we all listened to the recommendations and just stayed hunkered down for the following few days until it was interesting because I don't think there was ever a moment where the government came and said, okay, it's safe to go out. It's just people started to venture out little by little as they kind of felt like, okay, it sounds like it's okay outside. It doesn't sound like there's a civil war going on, as some news outlets tried to make it seem. So this topic, especially in my case, because I think I have chosen places for the most part that aren't necessarily the safest, and I want to put air quotes around safest. I think it's more that I choose places that end up in the news often, places that have political upheaval. And so, yeah, it on the surface sounds like I'm in, not safe places in comparison to the US. And I'm going to speak from my own experience, my own perspective, and I would never try to convince someone that they feel safe when they say that they don't. And I think that same respect should be given to me. So I think starting with my year abroad in France, obviously France is not a country that shows up in the news in negative light, like a lot of global South countries. And when I say global South, for those who don't know that term, it refers to many of the countries that are located below this like below the equator, some above, but it's almost close to that line of delineation. And a lot of those countries have had a rough go. These are not countries that are considered prosperous. Again, these are the types of countries that end up in the news because of political upheaval or gang violence, etc. So yeah, I after that, that was probably my first experience alone. So being in a country far away from my family, and of course, the normal concerns that they would have during my whole year, there was nothing that ever came out in the news. Luckily for me, this was before a lot of the social movements that are happening now, and this was before some of the terrorist attacks that France has suffered. So yeah, there was never any concern, and I don't think that I thought about it as much either. It wasn't until I moved to Haiti, which it's always interesting. People from Haiti, I think, sometimes have the worst ideas of what reality is. Even those who travel, who go, quite frequently, they hear something on the news and they believe it. Or they hear something on the news that's specific to a spot. I wouldn't even say a whole city, and it's generalized. And then they assume that nobody on the island is safe, and things are just hectic. But that was never my experience there. I remember, so the year that I was there, this was leading up to the second coup of Aristide, and yeah, it was pretty hectic. I mean, there were days that there were protests, and I wasn't able to get to work, but unfortunately, I guess, I think some people would see that as unfortunately. I don't, because I believe in civil liberties, and I think people should have the right to protest and demand things of their government when they're unhappy. So I didn't let that bother me, and I never felt unsafe. I remember standing like at that on the balcony of where my office was located, and watching a huge protest go up the street. And I just watched, and there was police, and to say that there was no violence, I can't say that. There probably was, just like we see a lot of violence with protests in the U.S., in France, in the U.K., everywhere. So yeah, it just personally, that did not cross a threshold for me of feeling like I'm unsafe and I need to leave. But like I said, every time that those instances would come on the news, there was a panic amongst my friends and family, and I can't blame them, and I appreciate the concern, but it's hard. It sometimes feels odd having to convince them that, no, I'm fine. It's okay. There's nothing. It's fine. And, then I think I started to think about how the news cycle in the US can be alarming. I think even more so now, but this was, I think it was typical at that time for something to happen, whether it be in the Caribbean and Latin America, and then you'd hear about it on the 10 o'clock news. So I'd say it wasn't immediate necessarily. It wasn't the internet era where everybody had the news on their phone. But when they did find out, then the deluge of phone calls would come. Now, again, after then moving back to the U.S. and then seeing a marked difference, because living in South Florida, there's some safety concerns, I would say, for me. Again, now some people may feel 100% safe in South Florida, and I, again, will not try to convince you otherwise. But I know for me, there were, whether it was being stopped by the police, or going out late at night and having to go through a neighborhood that was a little bit iffy, let's say, or my work actually took me to some pretty vulnerable communities. And most of the time I was only there during the day, but a couple occasions I was there in the evening, and I didn't feel safe. Like, quite honestly, leaving and driving through those communities, I had a sense of, I'm not from here, and I don't know enough, and I don't know enough people to actually get a sense of safety. Because I think part of my situation that is different from maybe the grand majority is the work that I do, that I've always done, has taken me to um, unsafe places, places that are going through either increased violence or some sort of humanitarian crisis. So I'm familiar with that, and I'm not uncomfortable in those situations. But I'm also pretty savvy, and I know better than to walk into an unknown location that is going through a moment of crisis, and to think that I'll be okay. I have my protocols when I go to those places, and I think that somehow kind of spills over into how I feel about living abroad. So, again, during my time in Florida, almost, I think it was about 7 years, never once did friends or family call when they saw something on the news. And I sometimes thought, okay, it's because they know that it's a large land mass. And, if they hear about it in one place, they kind of have an idea of where I actually live, and know that, I'm most likely, I'm not anywhere near where the issue is. But when I moved to, Venezuela, in 2009, I think that's when I realized no, because that's a pretty large landmass as well. And, the capital, Caracas, is a pretty large city too. So it wasn't about, knowing that, oh, if they heard something, or maybe it is. I think, it's a mix. Some of it is not fully understanding the landscape of where I live and how the city is set up, but I think the other part is just how it's relayed in the news. Again, it's often very generalized. Oh, trouble in Venezuela today. Like it's not. They don't give the specificities so that people go, oh, okay, that's a whole 3-hour plane ride from where my person lives. So I don't need to assume that something bad has happened. So again, I think that kind of started this acceptance on my behalf that people are going to hear things and they're going to worry. And all I can do is reassure them that I do feel fine. And if I don't, I always recognize my privilege in that sense, that for the most part, wherever I am, if something happens, most likely will have a way to leave. I don't have to stay in a foreign country if things are extremely unsafe, or a civil war breaks out, or whatever that may be. Usually there are mechanisms and there are ways to evacuate. So and that's not at the forefront of my mind. I think that's like, actually now, coming up on 8 years in Ecuador, that's not on my mind at all, because I feel like I'm home. I always recognize that, I'm a visitor, I am a guest here, but at some point you do kind of start feeling like this is my home. And although if it really were dire, there are ways for me to leave. And even Ecuadorians are finding ways to leave when they hit that threshold, when they hit that point of I no longer feel safe, or I no longer feel like I have opportunity here. But that is definitely far, far, far from my mind, regardless of what happened. I actually remember when the pandemic hit in 2020. That too was a question that I was asked. And at that point, I had been here 4 years. And, as everyone was evacuating, going back to quote unquote home, some people had asked me, like, are you going to leave? Are you going to go home? And I thought, but I am home. I don't even know where I would go. And this is knowing I have family, I have places that I could go if I need to, but that's not home. That's my family's home. So I probably started feeling like this a while back. And what I would recommend to anyone who's thinking like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be safe. Again, I think back, I don't know how many episodes when I talked about steps that you should take, and ways to go about finding a good place to settle. It's same idea. Go and visit. And in your visit, if there's any thing that's kind of giving you this feeling of like, I'm not safe here, or I don't feel safe, or I worry about um, being okay, or being attacked, or I'm worrying about violence, then that's not the place for you. And that's okay. Um, I, I have a little anecdote. Actually, I don't want to say it's an anecdote because I lived this. Just last year when we went to Europe, we were traveling by train from Paris to Barcelona. And at some point during the train ride, and it's pretty, I feel like it's like a 6 hour trip, but the train slowed down. And eventually, I don't know if it was the conductor, but somebody came on and said, "Oh, sorry, folks, we are experiencing delays because at this next stop," and they named it, there's been vandalism. And I thought, well, how could vandalism impact a, a high speed train? So interestingly, I went on the app, and it said, it repeated the same thing: delays because of vandalism, but underneath it gave the details. And there were people, and this is, again, part of all the social movements and the protests going on in France, that were throwing rocks at the rail. So they had to, of course, control that before they could let trains pull into the station. And the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, that's terrorism. And that's a very American thought. And then the next thing that came to my mind was, interesting how different countries will label things in a way so that it doesn't create that same sense of alarm. Said if a person in the US attacked a public transportation system, that person would be labeled a terrorist. And because it wasn't labeled that in France, we just slowed down, waited for them to remove the people, and then I think we ended up arriving like an hour late to Barcelona. So that and this is Europe, this is where oftentimes people think it's safe. I'll be okay. I won't be safe in Peru. I won't be safe in Ecuador. I won't be safe in Colombia, but I'll be safe in Europe. And that was just like another day. Really, it did not, no, it felt like no one batted an eye. Like and the thing that I walked away with was, I felt unsafe in that moment. I started to worry. And because I also had this feeling of, they're minimizing a situation that is, to me, very important and very dangerous. This is a public transportation system. This is high season. There are a lot of people traveling right now by train. And it was just like, oh, we'll just slow down. I don't know. But it's, so just to kind of give you my own perspective, and probably why, when although externally it looks like Ecuador's on fire, I've never felt what I felt on that train here in Ecuador. So again, a very personal choice, and it's a very personal decision. And I, again, would never try to convince somebody. If somebody came here to Quito and said, "Hey, I don't feel safe here," I respect that. At the same time, me saying I feel safer here than I feel in South Florida, or in Paris, or in Barcelona, I would appreciate that same respect in return. So that is it for this episode. I hope this was helpful. It was on my heart, on my mind, and I wanted to talk about it since, Ecuador has been in the news. And like I said, many places that I have lived stay on the news, and there's rarely any good news coming out of it. And I just wanted to share my perspective of why, that there's never a thought in my mind of, I'm not okay where I am, at least for now. Who knows what the future may hold? Who knows how I will feel in 5 years? But up until this point, I feel perfectly safe. I feel very good about being here with my family. All is well. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, be well.